Founded in 1916, the Arab Bureau was a small collection of British intelligence officers, headquartered in Cairo and working out of a cramped suite in the Savoy Hotel. It was charged with the task of coordinating imperial intelligence activities in the Middle East, track the regional direction of Ottoman-German activity, and disseminate propaganda amongst non-Indian Muslims. It's most often remembered for his role in instigating the Arab Revolt to break Ottoman control over the Arab-speaking Middle East. Located in Cairo rather than London, as was originally envisaged by Mark Sykes, who from 1879 to 1919, the Arab Bureau became a part of the city's complex military and political network, reporting through its director to the British High Commission in Egypt and ultimately the Foreign Office in London. The Bureau's staff regarded itself as a semi-autonomous policy-making arm of the government of Cairo, London and Simla. It dealt with contending stakeholders: Cairo Residency, Sudan Intelligence, Army Intelligence, Naval Intelligence, Indian Government, the War Office and the Foreign Office, each of which were competing for their own strategies. The Bureau's active involvement in providing the logistical support in terms of expert personnel, military hardware and financial assistance, which underpinned the Arab Revolt and contributed to its victorious outcome. Although T.E. Lawrence looms large, the Bureau's role in the Arab Revolt was not predicated upon the exercise of individual genius, but a product of a collective endeavour. Taking into consideration the desert nature of Arabia and its forbidden terrain, and maximising the use of human intelligence, HUMINT, signal intelligence, SIGINT, and image intelligence, IMINT, a handful of local bureau operatives working on the ground were eventually able to evolve a type of unconventional warfare. This entailed using small mobile fighting units, hit-and-run tactics, and the harassment of enemy troops rather than directly confronting them. It became known as guerrilla warfare, but for the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, this was the only form of war that was practical. Given this fact, the tribal Arab connection in confining the superior Ottoman forces to Medina for the duration of the war, and in assisting Edmund Allenby, 1861 to 1936, thrust into Palestine and beyond, needs to be recognised. Part of the mandate of the Arab Bureau was to generate propaganda in favour of Great Britain amongst non-Indian Muslims. It did so through newspapers, now hard to obtain, emanating from Cairo or published in the Hejaz. Al-Kibr began to appear following the outbreak of the Arab Revolt, and mostly edited by Syrian emigres in Egypt. It supported the uprising in the Hejaz, but chose to present it as a struggle for the attainment of general Arab national goals. In Cairo, two papers, Al-Kawkab and Jaridat Palestine, appeared. Both tried to make their Arab readers in Palestine and the remainder of Syria believe that Britain and its allies were fighting a war to defend Islam and its adherents, and to further Arab interests, and achieve their freedom. A Bureau propaganda directed at Arab audience was duplicitous, as the policies envisaged for the area by the British imperial overlords. From the beginning, however, the Bureau was vilified within imperial circles as a group of amateurs and incompetent pro-Arab dilettantes, and ever since it has borne much of the blame for Britain's terrible mishandling of Middle Eastern policy during and shortly after World War II. Some of the Bureau's personnel were military people recruited from sister intelligence and ancillary units, but many were civilians carrying bogus military ranks. people in academia or recent graduates of elite British universities. Examples of members include David Hogarth, 1862 to 1927, archaeologist, historian and museum curator, who became sub-director of the Bureau under the leadership of Brigadier General Gilbert Clayton, 1875 to 1929, Gertrude Bell, 1868 to 1926, historian, archaeologist, traveller and ultimately kingmaker in Iraq, on whom I've issued a vlog. Thomas Edward Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, 1888 to 1935, junior archaeologist, mapmaker and Alfred Gwilym, 1888 to 1965, a bright Oxford graduate in Oriental Studies at the cusp of an equally successful academic career. What should be obvious is that many are archaeologists. Before archaeologists became preoccupied with slandering Graham Hancock, they were experts on local culture, knew the terrain well, spoke the language of the region, and they excavate, and were good at codes. On the 4th of August 1914, the famous archaeologist Sophindas Petrie, a diary records Engelbach, Wiley, Gunn, all off training for the war. These became known as Petrie's Pups. Howard Carter, 9th of May 1874 to 2nd of March 1939, was a British archaeologist and Egyptologist who discovered the intact tomb of the 18th dynasty pharaoh Tutankhamun in November 1922, the best preserved pharaonic tomb ever found in the Valley of the Kings. He worked under the tutelage of Sir Flinders Petrie on for one season at Amarna, the capital founded by the pharaoh Akhenaten. In 1914, Lord Carnarvon received a concession to dig the Valley of the Kings. Carter led the work, undertaking a systematic search for any tombs missed by previous expeditions, in particular that of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. However, excavations were soon interrupted by the First World War, Carter spending the war years working for the British government as a diplomatic courier and translator. In fact, Carter claimed he spent the war in military service, but aged over 40, he was allegedly dismissed in 1915. He enthusiastically resumed his excavation work at the end of 1917. Before then, he carried secret dispatches for the British High Commission and secret messages between the British and the French and their Arab contacts, such as revolutionaries and deserters from the Ottoman army, and acted as interpreters in military interviews with potential Arab recruits. And no doubt his knowledge of the language and of Egyptians, acquired over 20 years of work in Egypt, proved useful in all these activities. At least once he may have had a more hands-on role. He is credited with blowing up the German dig-out house at Ramesseum, which British archaeologists considered an ugly red abomination and emblematic of German pushful vulgarity. A new use for the experience with explosives Carter had acquired while working with fellow EEF excavator Edward Neville at Deir al-Bahari. David Randall-MacIver, FBA, 31st of October 1873 to 30th April 1945, was a British-born archaeologist who later became an American citizen. He's most famous for his excavations at Great Zimbabwe, which provided the first solid evidence that the site was built by the Shona people. David Randall-MacIver provided another example of the transfer of skills from archaeological to military use. He began his professional archaeological career in 1898, working for Safinders Petrie in Egypt, uncovering the mortuary temple of Senwosret III at Abydos. He worked with Petrie from 1898 to 1902 and subsequently excavated in Rhodesia and Namibia, and was in no doubt that his archaeological experience could benefit the military. On the 27th of August 1914, MacIver set out what he perceived as his qualifications, claiming to be as nearly absolute master of German as any Englishman is pretty good at French and Italian and quite strong in Spanish. Having commanded large archaeological expositions, he was used to camp life and transport and was in perfect physical condition owing to his constant outdoor life. In 1914 he left the AGCS to work as a British intelligence officer in the First World War. His War Office files note his fair horsemanship, ability to speak Egyptian, Arabic and Greek, and a topographical knowledge of Germany, France, Belgium, Egypt and the Sudan. He initially served as an interpreter in France with the IEF Firasanpur Brigade HQ, but in November 1915 Field Marshal Sir John French suggested that his knowledge of Eastern Mediterranean and linguistic skills, MacIver could be more usefully employed there rather than France. After a crash course to brush up his Greek, MacIver sailed first to Alexandria and then to Salonika, where he served as an interpreter. He was promoted from second lieutenant to captain in 1916 and mentioned in dispatches in June 1918, before being demobbed in February 1919. In 1921 he moved to Italy to study Etruscan archaeology. He remained in Italy during World War II, assisting Allied Forces Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives programme, the famous Monuments Men, to preserve historical monuments and cultural property. Reginald Rex Engelbach, 9th of July 1888 to 26th of February 1946, was an English Egyptologist and engineer. He is mainly known for his works in the Egyptian Museum of Cairo, above all the compilation of a register of artefacts belonging to the museum. Reginald Engelbach had trained as an engineer in England, but had been sent to Egypt to convalesce in 1909. In 1911 he started a collaboration with Safinders Petrie as his assistant, excavating in various places such as Heliopolis, Arike and Harage. He later excavated in the Near East. Having become fascinated with ancient Egyptian culture, he studied Egyptian, Coptic and Arabic at UCL and worked with Petrie from 1911 to 1914, where his engineering skill proved useful in dealing with water in a pyramid well. He joined the Artist Rifles, a volunteer corps, popular with recruits from public schools and universities. In January 1915 he was appointed second lieutenant in the London Electrical Engineers and subsequently served in France and Gallipoli, and finally was sent by General Edmund Allenby to report on ancient sites in Syria and Palestine, an early monuments man. Battiscombe George Jack Gunn, FBA, 30th of June 1883 to 27th of February 1950, was an English Egyptologist and philologist. Battiscombe Gunn was another who had trained as an engineer but preferred Egyptology. Between 1908 and 1911, he worked as the sub-editor of the Continental Daily Mail in Paris, as a result of which he spoke French fluently and had also studied Greek, Latin, Hebrew and Arabic. He also seems to have been involved with the leaders of the occult community in London, Arthur Edward Waite of the Magical Order of the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley, who created his own order after he left the Golden Dawn. On the 10th of January 1906, Gunn was inducted into Waite's independent and rectified right. In 1913, he visited Egypt for the first time as epigrapher on the staff of Sir Flinders Petrie's Excavation at Harrogate near Fayum, working with Reginald Engelbach. He didn't have much time to put his skills to military use before allegedly being invalided out of the territorials in 1950. Rupert Duncan Wiley had studied Hebrew, Sanskrit and Arabic and worked with Petrie in the final pre-war season at Lahoun when they found the spectacular Lahoun treasure. Wiley joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, but in May 1915 Sir Percy Cox requested his transfer to the political and administrative staff employed in the India office. Riley was granted the temporary rank of captain, but without pay or allowances for that rank, in March 1918, and was mentioned in dispatches for distinguished and gallant services to duty by the Commander-in-Chief of the Mesopotamian Expeditionary Force in February 1919. He continued to serve as political officer in South Kurdistan after the war, but in 1919 he was assassinated in Amara by Kurds, assisted by local police. While he was stabbed in bed, a fellow officer attempted to shoot the assassins and ultimately jumped to his death through a window, taking two of his assailants with him. Even prior to the 20th century, Britain's policy towards the issues of an Arab caliphate and pan-Islam was far from neutral. It may seem strange and somewhat counterintuitive that Britain should interest itself in matters of Muslim politics. It's even stranger that these matters, with which most Muslims in the 19th century and early 20th century were unconcerned, should involve transnational, universal concepts that could easily create disruptions in the British Empire. In 1916, Sharif Hussein bin Ali, then Emir of Mecca, launched an armed rebellion, commonly known as the Great Arab Revolt, against the Ottoman Turks. Started as a British-backed insurgency in Ottoman-occupied Arab lands. The role of Lawrence is undisputed, but it's more likely that many of the archaeologists working in the Arab Bureau were heavily involved. Only the India office saw the potential danger in a new pan-Islam under the Arab banner, but they were hushed by the cabinet because the war needed this alliance. The Foreign Office certainly undertook some efforts to assure itself that the anti-Ottoman Arab insurgency would not affect India's Muslim population, not least as of the estimated 1.5 million Indian troops who fought to defend Britain. 400,000 were Muslims. In fact, in India, news of the revolt was announced by the government on the 23rd of June 1916, less than 3 weeks after it began in the Hijaz. Much to the dismay of the British Raj, most Indian Muslims widely condemned Sharif Hussein and the rebels. The Indian factor would be on the minds of British foreign policy circles during the Paris conference, at which the world's post-war order was effectively determined for decades to come. Most British officials in Egypt, such as Reginald Wingate, believed that even if there were one Arab claimant to the caliphate, it would appeal to Muslims nowhere. With the post-war dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, however, many Arabs found themselves divided into new states under British and French domination, laying the foundations of many of today's crises in the Middle East. But few British officials had recognised the incoherent contradiction in their promises to Zionists and Arabs between 1917 and 1919. Indeed, they believed that both Zionists and Arabs short-sightedly believed the common enemy to be the Ottomans. The first phase of the Salafiyya movement emerged amidst the reform-minded ulema of the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire during the late 19th century. Following the First World War, the Salafi ideas were spread and established amongst the intelligentsia. Political orientated scholars like Rashid Rida, who emphasised the necessity to establish an Islamic state that implements Sharia Islamic law, and thus laid the intellectual foundations for a more conservative strand of Salafiyya, which would also influence the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And thus we can see how British archaeologists were fundamental in creating the conditions not only for crisis in the Middle East, but in galvanising conservative Islam. Although it would be very wrong to see this as a coordinated policy by the British, and it would seem that concern about India dominated the latter thinking on the Middle East.